June 1830, it is sunrise. The Mediterranean is filled with ships, more than 600 of them. French warships, troop transports, supply vessels, all packed together in a massive formation stretching across the horizon. On their decks stand 37,000 French soldiers, many seasick after days of rough sailing. Some lean over railings, others sit on crates with rifles between their knees. Ahead of them rises the white city of Algiers, gleaming in the sun, its houses stacked against the hillside, its fortifications bristling with cannons. General Louis de Bourmont commands the invasion. His orders are clear: overthrow the Dey of Algiers, punish the insult delivered 2 years earlier when the Dey struck the French consul with a fly whisk. What began as a diplomatic quarrel has now become a full military operation. Bourmont expects resistance, but he does not expect a long campaign. Most officers believe France will seize the city, take concessions, and leave. The fleet anchors west of Algiers near Sidi Ferruch. Small boats carry soldiers to shore through crashing waves. Many stumble as they land, soaked and exhausted, but they form ranks quickly. Ottoman and Algerian defenders fire from the ridges, hitting the sand around them. French artillery is brought ashore piece by piece, horses pulling guns through the surf. Once assembled, they answer with well-aimed volleys that force the defenders back. For several days, heavy fighting continues along the coastal hills. The heat is punishing. The smell of gunpowder hangs in the air. The French advance slowly but steadily, pushing Ottoman troops toward the city's outer defenses. On July 4th, French artillery is positioned close enough to open fire on Algiers itself. The bombardment is relentless. Walls crumble. Smoke rises over the rooftops. By the next morning, July 5th, the Dey knows the situation is hopeless. He sends word that he will surrender the city if his life and the lives of civilians are spared. Bourmont agrees. French troops enter Algiers to find a city shocked and silent. The Ottoman Regency, which ruled Algeria for more than 3 centuries, collapses in a single day. What follows is confusion. Some French units loot palaces and storehouses before order is restored. Crowds gather in the streets, watching the tricolor flag rise over government buildings. Many residents expect the French to leave soon, just as previous invaders had done. In Paris, politicians think the same. But the French never leave. What began as a short punitive expedition becomes the first step in a long and brutal conquest. France now holds the city of Algiers, but they soon discover they have gained far more than they expected. Algeria is a vast land stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the edge of the Sahara. Its people are diverse, independent, and fiercely attached to their land. Along the coast lie the major cities, Algiers, Oran, and Constantine. These centers have been shaped by centuries of Ottoman rule. Their markets, mosques, and palaces reflect the influence of Istanbul. The population is a mix of Turks, Arabs, Jews, and freed slaves from across the Mediterranean. Life is urban, commercial, and tied to the sea. But the interior is completely different. Beyond the coastal hills lie plains, mountains, and desert valleys controlled by powerful tribes and confederations. Berber-speaking communities live in fortified villages in the Kabyle Mountains. Arab tribes move with their herds across the high plateaus. Religious brotherhoods, marabouts, hold enormous influence, guiding local politics, settling disputes, and uniting people under Islam. Under the Ottomans, the land was divided into 3 beyliks, provinces governed by beys who collected taxes and enforced order. But this system rested on negotiation, alliances, and tribal autonomy. No ruler, Ottoman or otherwise, ever controlled the entire land directly. Algerians were used to independence, and they expected to keep it. This becomes France's central problem. They hold a few coastal towns, but everything beyond them belongs to people who have no intention of accepting foreign rule. Tribes refuse French authority. Local leaders ignore French orders. Religious figures condemn the invasion as an attack on Islam. The French soon realize they have not conquered a territory, They have provoked a nation. The war that follows will not be a short campaign. It will last generations. The months after the fall of Algiers prove how fragile French control really is. In 1831, uprisings erupt across the countryside. Villages attack French patrols. Ambushes hit supply routes. Tribes unite in armed resistance. What looked like a quick victory becomes a spreading war. French columns march into the interior to restore order, but they are unfamiliar with the land. In the mountains, narrow passes funnel them into perfect ambush positions. In the plains, tribes mounted on fast horses strike quickly and disappear. French soldiers suffer from heat, lack of water, and constant attacks. Many die before ever seeing a battlefield. To strengthen their position, France sends reinforcements and new commanders. General Bertrand Clausel takes charge and launches aggressive campaigns to expand French territory. He captures Oran in 1831 after heavy fighting. A year later, he pushes east toward Constantine, but the city's defenders repel his forces. When he returns in 1837 with more troops, he takes the city, but the victory is hollow. The countryside remains hostile. French power only exists where French soldiers stand. Still, Paris is impatient. In 1834, the French government declares Algeria an official part of France, French national territory. But this declaration has little meaning on the ground. Most of the land remains outside French control. Coastal cities are garrisoned by thousands of troops, yet beyond the walls lie tribes who refuse to submit. French commanders begin using harsher tactics, burning villages, seizing crops, taking hostages. Instead of breaking resistance, this only unites more tribes against them. It is during this chaos that a new figure rises, one who will change the course of the war. Emir Abd al-Qadir, a young religious scholar and leader, is chosen by Western tribes to lead the struggle. He is disciplined, intelligent, and deeply respected. Unlike previous leaders, he organizes his forces into a real army. By 1834, the French realize they are no longer fighting scattered tribes. They are facing a national resistance movement. The war is about to enter its most intense phase. When the French believed Algeria was nearly pacified, a new leader rose from the west, one who would turn the scattered uprisings into a national resistance. His name was Emir Abd al-Qadir. Born in 1808, he was highly educated, deeply religious, and respected among the tribes. He knew the Quran by heart, studied philosophy, and came from a family known for wisdom and mediation. He was not a warlord or a tribal chief. He was a unifying figure. In 1832, after months of French expansion and growing fear among tribal communities, Western Algerian tribes gathered and elected Abd al-Qadir as their leader. They named him Emir and declared a jihad to defend their land. Abd al-Qadir accepted reluctantly at first, but once chosen, he committed fully. His first task was to unite the rival clans that had fought each other for decades. He traveled from valley to valley, meeting imams, elders, and warriors, urging them to stand together. Slowly, tribes that had never cooperated before came under one banner. He built a disciplined army divided into cavalry, infantry, and support units. He introduced training, strict discipline, and a clear command structure. His fighters wore uniforms and followed written rules of conduct. No looting, no harming civilians, no dishonoring prisoners. His moral code was strict and widely respected. Even French officers would later acknowledge his fairness. Between 1834 and 1839, Abd al-Qadir won several victories over French detachments. He used speed and mobility, hit-and-run tactics, feigned retreats, and sudden ambushes. French columns, unfamiliar with the terrain, often found themselves surrounded or cut off. When the French tried to negotiate, Abd al-Qadir proved he was not just a military leader but a diplomat. Two treaties, the Desmichels Treaty in 1834 and the Tafna Treaty in 1837, recognized his authority over much of the Algerian interior. France still held some coastal areas, but Abd al-Qadir controlled the heart of the country. During this period, he effectively built a state. He selected a capital at Tagdem, later moving it to Mascara. He created ministries, courts, tax systems, and a police force. He minted his own coins and regulated trade. Travelers wrote that his government was more organized than many European administrations. To many Algerians, this was the first time they saw their land united under a single ruler since before Ottoman rule. But the peace was temporary. In Paris, politicians wanted full control over the colony. French settlers demanded more land. Generals wanted a decisive victory. Tensions rose again in 1839 and war resumed. France sent larger and more aggressive forces. Two names became infamous: General Thomas Robert Bugeaud and General Louis Lamoricière. Their orders were simple: destroy Abd al-Qadir's base of support by any means necessary. They unleashed scorched-earth tactics. Villages were burned, wells were poisoned, crops were destroyed. Civilians were targeted. Entire regions were emptied to break the resistance. In contrast, Abd al-Qadir tried to maintain discipline and avoid harming non-combatants. His treatment of prisoners, French and Algerian, was recorded as humane. This moral difference became central to how Algerians remembered him. He was not only fighting for land but for dignity. Still, against the overwhelming power of the French army, his forces suffered heavy losses. By 1843, his capital at Tagdem was destroyed. His bases in the west fell one after another. He retreated into Morocco, hoping for support, but French pressure forced the Moroccan Sultan to drive him out. For 4 more years, he fought guerrilla campaigns across desert and mountain, refusing to surrender. But the toll on civilians was devastating. In 1847, after seeing his people exhausted, homeless, and starving, Abd al-Qadir made a decision. To spare further suffering, he surrendered on the condition that he and his followers would be allowed safe exile. France broke that promise and imprisoned him for years, but his reputation only grew. Across the Muslim world, he became a symbol of honor and resistance. In Algeria, his story would fuel future generations. Abd al-Qadir's struggle was the spark that kept the hope of independence alive, from the 19th century to the revolution a century later. With Abd al-Qadir defeated, French commanders declared the conquest complete. But the reality on the ground was very different. France controlled the major cities, a few valleys, and some coastal routes, but most of Algeria remained outside effective authority. The moment Abd al-Qadir's army disappeared, new uprisings flared, especially in the Kabyle Mountains and the Ouarez region. The Kabyles, fiercely independent and skilled in mountain warfare, refused to accept French rule. Their villages were tightly knit, governed by councils and supported by strong alliances. The Ouarez tribes were equally difficult to subdue, spread across rugged terrain that French soldiers could barely navigate. What France called pacification was really a continuous cycle of rebellion and suppression. To break resistance, General Bugeaud introduced the tactic of razzias, lightning raids meant to punish entire regions. French columns destroyed grain stores, burned orchards, and captured livestock. Villages that supported rebels were set on fire. Civilians were forced into harsh conditions, often left without food or shelter. General Saint-Arnaud took these methods even further, openly writing in letters that he burned entire communities to force obedience. This was not just war, it was colonization through destruction. France no longer aimed to simply control Algeria, they aimed to remake it. Their government declared Algeria an extension of France, not a distant colony. That meant French settlers, called colons or later Pieds Noirs, were encouraged to take land. Ship after ship arrived from France, Spain, Malta, and Italy. Thousands of Europeans settled along the coast, then pushed inland, claiming fertile farmland. The French authorities seized land from Algerian communities, often without compensation. Whole tribes were displaced so settlers could build vineyards, farms and towns designed to look like southern France. New cities rose, Boufarik, Blida, and Philippeville. Roads and railways were built, not for Algerians but to strengthen French control and connect European settlements. French law replaced Islamic and customary law. Arabic was pushed out of administration. Mosques were sometimes seized and turned into churches. The land itself was being transformed. The pacification that France celebrated in newspapers was, in truth, the beginning of a century of resentment. Algerians watched their land shrink, their rights fade, and their traditions come under attack. Many were forced into wage labor on farms that once belonged to their ancestors. The countryside changed from a patchwork of tribal lands to a colonial system built around European privilege. Resistance never fully disappeared. Even without Abd al-Qadir, uprisings continued at a local level. Tribes fought isolated battles. Religious leaders inspired revolts. Villagers hid in mountains to avoid French patrols. But the superior firepower and relentless pressure of the French military gradually expanded their hold. By the late 1840s, France officially controlled most of northern Algeria, but only because they had emptied large regions of their original inhabitants. Pacification was not a peaceful process. It was a campaign of force, starvation, and displacement. France believed they had secured the colony. They had not. They had only planted the seeds of a deeper, more lasting resistance that would erupt again and again, until the entire colonial system finally broke in the 20th century. By the 1850s, France controlled the major cities in the coastal belt, and now the French government turned toward reshaping Algeria itself. This was not just occupation anymore, it was transformation. Roads, ports, and rail lines began to appear across the landscape. Engineers built new routes linking Algiers to Oran in the west and Constantine in the east. These projects were designed to move troops quickly, ship grain to Europe, and expand French settlements. They were not built for Algerian communities. Still, they changed the way the land looked and worked forever. New neighborhoods rose on top of older ones. In Algiers, wide French-style boulevards replaced twisting Ottoman streets. Roman ruins were excavated, but living Algerian quarters were pushed aside. Churches and European-style schools began appearing next to mosques, symbols of a new cultural order. French officials introduced the Code Civil, replacing Islamic law in courts. Arabic was removed from administration, meaning Algerians now had to speak French to interact with their own government. Contracts, taxes, and legal disputes were all handled in a language many people didn't know. Overnight, entire communities became illiterate in the eyes of the colonial administration. In the countryside, the impact was even harsher. French land seizures accelerated. Traditional communal farming systems collapsed as fertile fields were declared state land and given to European settlers. The best farmland, especially in the Midija Plain, was transformed into vineyards and wheat estates run by colonists. Algerians who once farmed their own crops now worked as cheap laborers on lands that used to belong to their tribes. This disruption, combined with drought and heavy taxation, caused famine. In the mid-1850s and again in the 1860s, entire villages starved. French records admitted hundreds of thousands died. The colonial economy grew, exports of wine, grain, and citrus increased, but Algerians benefited little. Most of the wealth stayed with settlers and companies in France. 1860, Emperor Napoleon III visited Algeria. He toured the new colonial towns, met tribal leaders, and announced a vision of Algeria as a kingdom of Arabs and French. He promised legal protections, land rights, and a shared future. Many Algerians hoped this meant reforms and the end of land seizures. But after he returned to France, these promises faded quickly. Settlers resisted anything that protected natives, and the administration prioritized European interests. By the late 1860s, Algeria had been reshaped by colonial rule. Roads, railways, and new towns stood where orchards and farmlands once were. The economy was larger but unequal. Algerians had become tenants or laborers on their own soil, governed by foreign law in a country that no longer belonged to them. The physical conquest of the land was nearly complete. The conquest of the people, however, would never fully succeed. Even after Abd al-Qadir's surrender, and even after France rebuilt cities and seized farmland, resistance refused to die. It simply moved to the mountains and the desert, where French armies struggled to fight effectively. The Kabyle tribes of the north were the first major test. Proud, independent, and living in rugged terrain, the Kabyles maintained their own assemblies, traditions, and communal laws. They had not been fully involved in Abd al-Qadir's movement, but they had no intention of allowing foreigners to dominate their mountains. In 1857, France launched one of its largest campaigns yet, the Kabyle War. Tens of thousands of French soldiers marched into the Algeria mountains, aiming to crush resistance once and for all. The Kabyles fought with precision, ambushing columns, cutting off supplies, and disappearing into the terrain. Villages supported fighters with food and shelter, and the entire region rallied to defend itself. The French responded with artillery, burning villages, and punitive expeditions. After months of fighting in 1857 and 1858, France finally broke major Kabyle strongholds and forced the region into submission. But even then, the Kabyles did not see themselves as conquered. They adapted, rebuilt, and waited for the next opportunity to resist. At the same time, French forces pushed south toward the Sahara. Until now, the French presence had been limited to fertile coastal regions. The interior desert, home to oases, nomadic tribes, and key caravan routes, remained outside control. The French government wanted the Sahara for two reasons: strategic depth and access to trans-Saharan trade. Control of the desert also meant preventing future rebellions from using it as a sanctuary. Columns led by officers like Colonel Yusuf and later by commanders of the African army advanced deep into the Sahara. They occupied oases such as Biskra, Taugert, and later Ouagla. They clashed with desert tribes who refused to submit, and they faced harsh conditions: sandstorms, heat, and long supply lines. As the French moved even further south, they entered lands controlled by Tuareg confederations. These groups, masters of the desert, fought fiercely, but were slowly overwhelmed by French firepower and relentless pressure. By the early 1860s, France could claim military control over nearly all of Algeria, from the Mediterranean coast to the edges of the Sahara. But control on paper was not the same as loyalty. The mountains remained defiant. The desert tribes remained wary. Islam remained the foundation of cultural identity. French rule was accepted only under force, not consent. Across Algeria, the country appeared quiet, but it was the silence of exhaustion, not surrender. Resistance had been beaten down but not broken. The land was conquered, but the people would remember the losses, the burned villages, and the stolen farms. This quiet struggle between a colonial power and a nation unwilling to disappear would define Algeria for the next century. By 1871, Algeria had been under French rule for more than 40 years. The conquest was brutal, the resistance long, and the transformation of the land constant. But the French believed the worst was behind them. They believed the country was pacified. They believed the Algerians had been crushed into silence. They were wrong. In Europe, France suffered a humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The French Empire collapsed. Paris fell. The government was shaken. Tens of thousands of French soldiers were dead or captured. Overnight, France was weak and distracted, and Algeria saw its chance. Across the colony, anger that had been building for decades began to rise. Land seizures had pushed families into poverty. Taxes were high. French settlers were gaining political rights, while native Algerians were denied basic citizenship. The famine of the 1860s had killed hundreds of thousands, while colonial officials protected settler farms. All of it fueled long-stored resentment. In the spring of 1871, rebellion finally erupted. The uprising began in Kabylia, led by Sheikh Mokrani, a respected tribal leader whose authority had been stripped by French rule. His brother Balmazrag rallied fighters across the region. They were joined by Sheikh Hadid, head of a powerful religious brotherhood whose influence stretched across the mountains. When Hadid declared jihad against the French, the call spread rapidly. Soon more than 200 tribes rose in revolt. Tens of thousands of fighters took up rifles, swords, and whatever weapons they could find. It was the largest Algerian uprising since the days of Abd al-Qadir. French authority crumbled overnight. Garrison posts in the interior were overrun. Lines of communication were cut. Settlers fled from isolated farms and towns, retreating toward the coast under military escort. In some areas, entire French communities were evacuated as rebel forces swept in. For months, the rebellion spread across Kabylia and the high plateaus. Villages expelled French officials. Supply convoys were ambushed. Colonial administrators barricaded themselves inside government buildings. The scale of the rebellion shocked France. This was not a local revolt, but a nationwide rising driven by decades of resentment. But once France recovered from its defeat in Europe, it struck back with overwhelming force. Regiments arrived from metropolitan France and from other colonies. Columns marched into the mountains, burning villages, seizing livestock, and destroying crops. Suspected supporters of the rebellion were arrested by the thousands. Entire communities were fined. Tribal lands were confiscated on a massive scale. Some of the best property in Kabylia was handed to settlers as punishment. Sheikh Mokrani was killed in battle. Sheikh Hadid was captured. Balmazrag was hunted down and executed. By the end of 1871, the rebellion was crushed. The consequences were devastating. More than 400,000 hectares of land were seized from native communities. Thousands of families were displaced. Prisoners were sent to remote labor camps, including New Caledonia in the Pacific. Kabylia, once fiercely independent, suffered under collective punishment for generations. The uprising of 1871 was the last large-scale Algerian revolt of the 19th century. It did not end French rule, but it burned itself into national memory. For decades afterward, Algerians spoke of Mokrani and Hadid as symbols of honor, unity, and the refusal to surrender. Their rebellion would be remembered more than 70 years later, when a new generation rose again to fight for independence. The French conquest of Algeria reshaped not only a country, but an entire era. What began in 1830 as a short expedition meant to punish the Day of Algiers turned into the foundation of France's African empire. Algeria became the model for how France would rule across the continent, through force, settlement, administration, and cultural transformation. After the uprisings of the 1870s were suppressed, France reorganized Algeria into 3 departments: Algiers, Oran, and Constantine. On paper, these were treated as full extensions of France, the same status as departments in Europe. French settlers voted, held office, and shaped policy. But native Algerians did not share those rights. They remained subjects, not citizens, unless they abandoned Islamic law and accepted the French civil code, a choice few were willing to make. The French language spread through administration, courts, and education. Children in government schools learned French history, French literature, and French geography. Arabic was pushed out of public life. The architecture of Algiers, Oran, and other cities changed as wide boulevards, European neighborhoods, and government buildings rose over older quarters. Railways and roads bound the country into a single colonial economy. In the end, the story of Algeria under French rule is a story of power and resilience. France built roads, cities, and institutions, but it never broke the people who lived there. Algerian identity survived war, famine, and occupation, and when the 20th century arrived, that identity would rise again.